I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. The rise of militias is a national phenomenon and a curious one. They have gone from Waco and Ruby Ridge-filled anti-government rage of the 1990s to becoming parastatal organizations, or at least supportive of a faction of government against another, as we saw on January 6, 2021. This goes against the strongly libertarian streak in traditional thinking about militias as organizations interested in curbing federal power. For this episode, I talk with American University professor and domestic militias expert Carolyn Gallagher about the problem at large and her research project looking at 4 southern Virginia counties where the county government tried to pass resolutions recognizing the militia. The move to recognize militias followed more than 100 Virginia counties and towns declaring themselves Second Amendment sanctuary jurisdictions following Democratic victories in Virginia's governorship and the state legislature in 2019. Stay with us. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Valeria Stewart, an Arlington-based, roots and Argentinian-tinged world music singer-songwriter, and her trio Crooked Sparrow. Kevin Dudley on guitar and mandolin, Valeria Stewart on vocals and guitar, and Jenny Smith on the violin. You can find Valeria's music in Spanish and English on her YouTube channel at Valeria Stewart Music. In the news this week, Maryland and Montgomery County may be among the richest states and counties in the country, but they have a reputation, as Josh Starr, former MCPS superintendent, likes to say, to want to be second best. But 2 policy changes, one in effect and one proposed, show that the state and the county may be ahead of others in some respects. First, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin removed college as a requirement for more than 90% of state government jobs. Maryland had done this last year in response to labor shortages. Maryland's then Republican governor, Larry Hogan, drew praise for his action from no less than Barack Obama. Other states followed: Alaska, Utah, Pennsylvania, Colorado, North Carolina, and New Jersey, and now Virginia. Even President Biden, in his 2023 State of the Union address, called out high-paying jobs that didn't require college degrees. This is an interesting position to be in. One of the comparative advantages of a region like Washington, D.C., is the high levels of education. In Montgomery County, 2/3 of the population has graduate degrees, which is reflected in the high household income in the region, currently over $140,000 a year. Amazon's choice of Northern Virginia for its second headquarters reportedly hinged on the Commonwealth's investment in higher education there. But there is an argument that all of this is a dysfunction. Degree inflation is the idea that employers are asking for college degrees for jobs that used to be held by non-college goers and are to this day. Vox, the online news website, reported a study which found that 2/3 of production supervisor job notices required college degrees, but only 16% of those who held that position had college degrees. Degree inflation particularly has hurt those who could not get to college due to money or preparation, and those who were overburdening themselves with debt to work towards jobs that don't require college. These arguments demand a rethinking of higher education, specifically public investment in higher education. But that is a position few governments would be willing to take. Public investment in higher education is a primary avenue of upward mobility, and turning around that cultural expectation is well near impossible. Montgomery County Public Schools, for example, has been wanting to expand vocational education for well near 10 years, but parents, it seems, want their kids to go to college if they can. And consequently, MCPS's efforts have been limited. The issue then is really the current labor shortage and how we understand it. Take public education, where there is a shortage of bus drivers and a shortage of teachers. Teachers need a college degree. Bus drivers do not. Do we want to remove college requirements for teachers? Probably not. Though Florida reportedly is hiring veterans without college degrees as teachers. But for bus driver type of jobs, which don't need a college degree and yet demand one, it makes sense to get rid of the requirement. Equally, however, this discussion is beside the point for many of those jobs. Bus drivers are short, not because employers are demanding they be college educated, but because the prevailing wage is low. Drivers and school buses roughly matched up in numbers prior to the pandemic. So what happened? The pandemic took a terrible toll, but it did not dramatically kill off bus drivers. Instead, bus drivers moved out of the driver workforce, possibly because they found higher paying jobs. Reducing qualifications may alleviate the labor shortage in the real short term, but over the longer term, higher wages and better working conditions attract more people. Montgomery County is the first county in the nation to try to allow, officially and in a regulated way, renting of home amenities such as swimming pools and gyms. Uber and Airbnb turned the sharing economy out into the mainstream. Renting home swimming pools and home gyms could similarly create a brand new market segment for short-term rentals. Unofficial and unregulated short-term renting of homes, cars, amenities have probably long existed, but licensing and regulation allow previously unimagined businesses to grow by sorting out legal, fiscal, zoning, social, and political ramifications. Montgomery County Council members Will Joando, Kristen Mink, and Don Lutke proposed the bill earlier this year that would require homeowners renting out to register and pay a licensing fee. Presumably, there would be some enforcement of quality and contract terms. But some residents are upset at the intrusion this commercialization of residential assets brings. A group of 36 residents, mainly from Chevy Chase and Rockville, are opposing increased noise, traffic overuse, and general degradation of their neighborhoods. Short-term rentals even challenge the traditional separation of residential and commercial zoning. Notably, County Executive Mark Elrich has spoken against the bill sponsored by his allies on the council. County Council staff is analyzing the issue. Meanwhile, Will Joando, the bill's lead sponsor, has announced a run for the U.S. Senate from Maryland and will possibly need to look for support from those opposing the bill now. That may be the thing that sinks official pool sharing in the county. I'll be back with American University professor and U.S. militias expert Carolyn Gallagher. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta.
Te fuiste un día oscuro, nublado para mí. Ya no estabas en mis brazos, no te pude perseguir. Son misterios del amor cuando uno se separa sin saber dónde llegar. Día más oscuro.
Carolyn Gallagher, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me.
We think of militias mainly in Michigan and Texas and faraway states. But you've been studying militias closer to home. What are you finding?
My first interaction with a militia was in Kentucky when I was going to grad school at the University of Kentucky. And I ended up doing a dissertation on the Kentucky state militia movement. And so I've been tracking them for a long time. And one of the things that I think is important to know about militias is that there's this kind of cyclical phase, up and down, up and down. And right now, with Trump out of office, they've been a little quiet because of the sedition conspiracy trials and things like that. But they're actually quite active on the ground at the county level. And I'm finding that they are working with local governments.
What do you mean working with local governments?
Well, historically, and again, I mean sort of recent history, if you go back to the militia movement in the 1990s, they were anti-government. They were very suspicious of government. And what I mean when I say working with governments is, in a sense, putting aside those anti-government views and saying, well, if we can control the organs of power, it's actually to our advantage. But at the local level, what they're basically doing is working with boards of supervisors or county councils to help pass legislation that is seen as pro-militia.
What is an example of that?
Well, so I've seen in my recent research, two kinds of laws. One are Second Amendment sanctuary city laws that are being passed in many parts of the country and at the county level. And then in Virginia, where I'm working on a project right now, what I'm also seeing are resolutions formally recognizing militias, counties formally recognizing militias.
Let's talk a little bit first about the Second Amendment sanctuary laws. Is that common now?
Well, in Virginia in 2019, after the elections where we had a major sea change and who was in power, it's the first time in 25 years that you had Democratic control of all three branches of the government. And so shortly after that, in about a 2.5-month period, I believe it was something like 103 counties and cities in Virginia instituted Second Amendment sanctuary city resolutions in a 2.5-month period. And again, there are about, I think it's 133 counties and cities in the state, or 134. So this was a big percentage of them. About 78% of Virginia's counties and cities did this. And again, keeping in mind, because Maryland's a little bit different, most cities, even if they're independent municipalities, are inside of counties. In Virginia, cities are not inside of counties. They're separate entities.
Did the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, do anything about it? Because they were in Democratic hands at that time.
No, they did not. They did not. And I think it's also really interesting, too, if you just think about whether or not militias even have the legality to exist. According to the Virginia Constitution, in fact, I believe most state constitutions in the U.S. prohibit militias being mustered by anyone but the county, or I'm sorry, the state government. So in Virginia, a militia can only technically exist if the governor, calls it into action or calls it into being. And of course, Governor Northam at the time had not done that.
That's interesting. So a Democratic governor, a Democratic state legislature, they did not act against these new laws. Is it the case that they didn't want the fight?
The state's attorney general did say, something along the lines of we won't let this stand. But that was just, it was words. It wasn't anything. There was no action behind it. And of course, partly these resolutions are symbolic, because what they're basically saying is, well, if a federal case comes in here that's related to possession of illegal firearms or whatever, we're not going to participate in that. That doesn't happen a whole lot of the time anyway. So a lot of this is kind of, symbolic jostling. But I think, ironically, after Oklahoma City, one of the things that's so strange about that is that, after that happened, very few states and counties really went after militias aggressively. They took a very kind of like, don't poke the bear, don't pull the tail of the tiger kind of approach.
Does it work?
Well, okay, so let's think about this in just practical terms. 1995 was a while ago, but the Oklahoma City bombing was, a horrific event. And it was conducted by someone that was, loosely attached to militias in Michigan, and certainly attached to militia ideology. And, in a lot of places that would have really put a freeze and a chill on, the groups themselves. And it would have really pushed into action state enforcement against these groups. And instead, we really didn't see a lot of that. And in fact, at the same time that was happening, you had people in Congress, Helen Chenoweth, for example, she's since passed away, but she was a congresswoman in Idaho, held hearings on so-called black helicopters related to Ruby Ridge.
Right.
And of course, the black helicopter kind of framing is a conspiratorial sort of thing, that the black helicopters belonged to the UN and they were in the US illicitly. So you even at the time, you started to see people in Congress defending these groups. And again, you could argue that the way the government handled Ruby Ridge and Waco was poor, and still not support militia groups, and still not give a voice to the conspiracy theories about them. So I guess my point here would be, there's some complicity and there's some connections between ideological connections between the extremists on the ground and people in public office. And between 1995, when that happened, and today, it's only gotten worse, or the level of connections has gotten stronger.
Right now, it seems that there is, a feeling that these groups are guerrillas when Democrats are in power. And I believe you have said that they are, paramilitary when Republicans are in power. So in a sense that there is this overlap.
Yes,
right?
very much so.
So that is I would imagine, a qualitative change in the militia movement from the Waco legacy to now.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I will say, if you take these groups at their word, and you took them at their word in the 90s that they were suspicious of federal power, then what I expected to see after the Iraq wars and the Afghan wars was that they would be very suspicious of, heavy militarization by the federal government. But really what you saw during the Bush years is that militia groups really sort of stood back and were relatively quiet. There was actually some protest against the Patriot Act, but not a lot. And so it was odd in a sense if you just bought their sort of rhetoric as true and forthright and not sort of covering for something else, that they would be in the streets complaining about the Patriot Act, but they weren't. And then when Obama was elected as president, the numbers, if you go and look at the Southern Poverty Law Center's numbers on hate groups and anti-government groups, which is where most militias are categorized, those numbers go way, way up. And then when he steps out of office and Trump comes into office, the numbers go down, but not a lot. And in part, I think that's because they saw in Trump, as did white nationalists and neo-Nazis, someone that was going to support them and favor what they wanted. And so they kind of then changed their stance to become pro-MAGA, right? And so, it's ironic to me at one level that, the January 6th insurrection was about helping maintain federal power in the hands of one person. I mean, the militias in the 90s said the federal government shouldn't exist except for defense against foreign enemies, right? And so, they were there, like they got a taste of power and they were ready to serve as, sort of the street forces. And so the Proud Boys aren't a militia, but when Trump said, stand back and stand by, a lot of people on the far right, including anti-government groups, were like, okay, we're ready. Call us up as your paramilitary force, your state force, your federal force, even if we're not directly connected, and we will do your bidding. And that's really antithetical to the anti-governmentism that was sort of, that was driving the movement in the 90s.
How do you understand the paradox?
They were never fully anti-government. They were anti-government of government that they didn't like. So, you can see the numbers again, if you track anti-government groups looking at their numbers, from Bill Clinton to the present, the numbers always go up under Democrats. They go down under Republicans. The one shift that is interesting between like Clinton and Bush on the one hand, and between Obama and Trump on the other hand, is that the highest numbers, that Clinton got, they were very low under Bush. And then Obama, the number of militia groups under Obama were much higher than they were under Clinton. And then when the numbers go back down under Trump, they don't go down to the level that they're still at the high level that Clinton had. We often think about the militias only in the U.S., and we only think of them in terms of our benchmarks to past or present in the U.S. We don't think about what these groups look like in the rest of the world. And if you go to places like Colombia or Northern Ireland or Sri Lanka or other places, and you see, unofficial armed groups, they're often divided between pro-state and anti-state, or guerrilla and pro-state paramilitary, or, anti-state paramilitary and pro-state paramilitary, right? They're all illicit or not formal groups, but who they're fighting and who they're fighting on behalf is often related in some form or fashion to how they view the state. And so what's happened in the U.S. with militias is they've gone from a guerrilla stance to a paramilitary stance.
We bought the war back home.
I mean, yes and no. I do want to be really careful and say, that I don't think that veterans are necessarily any more susceptible to right-wing mobilizing than other people, right? I think the way to think about that is that these groups, militias, the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, they're targeting veterans, right? Or they're targeting young men who haven't served in wars. And so I'm not so sure that we brought the war home, but that certainly when the war came home, right-wing extremists took advantage of that.
What about between the police and the militias?
Well, I mean, I think there's two kind of elements going on. One is law enforcement is very scattered in the U.S. We have you have sheriffs, then you have elected county and city police departments, and so there's hundreds or if not thousands of actual police. So it's difficult to be able to say anything systematic about all of them. beyond very general facts, which is we know that law enforcement officers are sometimes extremist. And I don't know that we know that the percentage of people in law enforcement are any more likely to be extremists than, the number of extremists in a town. I mean, I don't think we have that kind of data, but I do know that law enforcement officers are not supposed to have extremist views or hateful views because they have to police everybody and they have to police them fairly and consistently, which means you don't want a white supremacist police officer who is going to target Black or Hispanic people, for example. So the percentage of extremists in law enforcement should be zero.
You're looking very closely at Southern Virginia counties. What counties are you looking at? What are you finding?
So I'm looking at 4 counties: Bedford County, Campbell County, Halifax, and Franklin. Campbell and Halifax are in what's called Southside Virginia, and Bedford and Franklin are in sort of central Virginia on the edge of the Piedmont into the mountains. And these counties are older, less wealthy, and with the exception of Halifax, whiter than Virginia. They are also they're not poor. They're just they're below those statistics for Virginia. And in 2019, as we were talking about, I think it was 78% of the counties and cities in the state issued Second Amendment resolutions that passed. And then over the next 6 to 9 months, it looks like several states considered, including the 4 I'm looking at, considered resolutions formally recognizing militia groups in those 4 counties. 2 of the counties, Bedford and Campbell, passed resolutions formally recognizing the militias, and the other 2 did not. One of them, Franklin, passed a watered-down resolution that commended public service. It was sort of a washed out version of we support volunteerism, and the local militia guy was really angry because he was like quoted in the local newspaper complaining because this was not what we had asked for. And then in Halifax, it was interesting because the Halifax City Council actually tabled the resolution, and then they didn't just table it and leave it there. They actually, the following meeting, they took it off the table. And in the discussion where they were talking about that, there was this sort of interesting conversation based on the Board of Supervisors notes that, well, what happens if they go off the rails? Are we legally responsible for them? Or, what exactly happens if they do something that they're not supposed to do? So I'm still trying to comb through all of the county and city Board of Supervisors notes. There may be other counties that have considered these, but we have so far, we know of 2 that have passed these resolutions. The other thing I will say is if you look at the Board of Supervisor meeting minutes, it doesn't look like in Campbell County that it was discussed at all. It looks like it was sort of brought up and passed with very little discussion. Again, meeting minutes are not always indicative of what happened in an actual meeting, but it was passed very, very quickly. And so both Bedford and Campbell County militias are now, they have kind of a formal imprimatur of recognition, and they haven't stayed inside their county boundaries. So both of these counties border Lynchburg, Virginia, which you may know about Lynchburg from its Liberty University and televangelist past and present. They have, I believe it's the Campbell County Militia, maybe also the Bedford, have gone into informally police Black Lives Matter and reproductive rights rallies. And they weren't invited into the county to do that. They weren't called up by the governor or the mayor of Lynchburg. Not that the mayor of Lynchburg has the power to do that, but just stating, militias love to say that we're coming in and providing security, but nobody's asked them to come in and provide security.
What do you think is the central difference then between Bedford and Campbell on the one hand and Franklin and Halifax on the other?
The boards of supervisors in Bedford and Campbell appear very supportive of these groups and are somehow connected to them, although it's unclear exactly how. Whereas in Halifax and Franklin, it doesn't appear that there was an obvious connection between them. That, so, these are not like blue counties, right? These are conservative rural districts, but there's less sort of like a clear connection between them. Also, I believe Bedford has a sheriff who is, they have a sheriff. Not all places in the country have sheriffs, who is supporting this. We had someone tell us in Bedford County, a person that we interviewed about this, that the Bedford militia is anonymous. And I said, well, does that mean that nobody in the county, like on the board of supervisors or the sheriff, they don't know who they are because they recognize the group, they don't know who's in it? And this person told us the sheriff told them that they are anonymous, but they are headed by a businesswoman of good character or something like this. So clearly what you have there is like an illicit armed group, a board of supervisors, and a sheriff who are all operating from the same playbook. And that does not appear to exist in Halifax or in Franklin. Campbell County is also interesting because their militia appears to be aligned quite closely with Bob Good, the 5th district, congressional district in Virginia. Campbell County is, I think, all of part of it is in his district. When he won the Republican primary for the district in 2022, and it was sort of like a launch party or, an acceptance speech, he was joined on stage by the Campbell County militia.
These resolutions in Bedford and Campbell, do they mention specific groups, or is it a general support for militias?
It just says the militia. So it's presuming there's a militia behind these resolutions. And, if the sheriff will return my email, I'd like to ask him about this because, you haven't named a particular militia necessarily, but what happens if your militia, you've recognized splinters, which is very common on the far right, right? Militia groups are constantly, these far right groups are constantly having these internal spats, and they break up. So, and then they create groups. So are you then going to recognize both militias? And if they start fighting, are you going to police just one of them and not the other? Like which one gets to keep the recognition as you move forward?
So they don't say militias in plural. It's just the militia singular, right?
If you look at the resolutions, they're really general. So, they have a number of whereas statements, and then at the end they say, they have be it resolved. And the phrasing they use is, be it further resolved that in order to support the militia, enhance the safety and security of the citizens of Bedford County, and establish, as our founders intended, a barrier against tyrannical government, the board hereby expresses its intent to. And then it basically it has a bunch of different things, but it just says, the militia, or, it's kind of interesting. So on the one hand, it talks about the militia, but then it also talks about the right to assemble and train for arms individually or in groups as members of the militia from or in Bedford County. So it's very general, right? It's very, that's the right word for it. It's got a lot of wiggle room in it.
Well, on the other hand, it also has wiggle room to crack down on the people that the sheriff doesn't agree with.
Yes.
So if the militia should splinter, then the sheriff will probably have to pick one side, and then the other people stop being the militia because then they have decided that that's not the militia, right? So it's both. So the singularity there ensures that whatever militia exists remains tied to the county preferences, if you will.
Yes. And then imagine if you're the sheriff, right? And let's say two of your friends in the militia start fighting.
who gets to carry the formal recognition? And and we talked to
that gives the sheriff greater power, is
yes,
what it does.
It does, yes.
Right? So the sheriff can then arbitrate between them and becomes the person that makes the militia the militia.
Yeah, and he could also deputize, right? I mean, he could deputize the militia or the part of the militia that supports him to go after the other part of the militia, right? And so there's a lot of what happens if things that any non-ideologically motivated board, Republican or Democrat, would have issues with. The other thing is, if you look at the resolutions, they're clearly based on a template. So it's not clear who wrote the template. It looks like it might be the Virginia Citizens Defense League, although they're not acknowledging that in public. But they were behind the Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions in some form or fashion. And they were also behind the 2020 lobby day, where all the anti-gun, the NRA and other pro-gun groups and militias came to Richmond on lobby day and made a show of force. But so they're templates basically, and they get changed very little from one resolution to the other. They change the county name, and some of them go a little bit further to say they won't spend any county resources on quote unquote unconstitutional measures of any sort. But they're just templates. And so at that level, you're just kind of, you're trying to do like a factory production. And again, the Second Amendment resolutions, it was like this. I mean, 78% of the counties and cities in the state passed a Second Amendment resolution in Virginia between the election in November of 2019 and early 2020. And then a couple months later, I think the first resolution is introduced that we know of in March, I believe. March or February.
Does the Virginia Citizens Defense League own up to the fact that they engineered the Second Amendment resolutions, or do they own up to nothing?
They don't really own up to anything, but their fingerprints are on it. We're still trying to dig through that. Some of these militia groups even are like, they get 501(c) status, right? So, they're just nonprofits, and they're they get nonprofits status, and then they can raise money, and there's, what you can and what you can't track. And then there are power brokers that are not in a formal organization, but they're acting in concert, and those are kind of informal networks that are deep and tied together, and they're working with other groups, and they're hard. That all is hard to untangle. It's hard to untangle that, but you have that. And then you have, the actual armed groups themselves. And so that's the sort of informal layer of it. And then you have a board of supervisors and a sheriff or a police department. And that's what's so scary about it. You're not talking about a militia that's aligned against everybody else, right? You have a militia group, and it looks like they're just kind of embedded in the fabric of the county's politics.
What are the options available to states in dealing with them?
Well, it's difficult, right? So, I mean, you could go after them aggressively, but it's not an option that is likely, I think. I just think not even if you put aside the worry about infiltration into law enforcement by these groups, I think sheriffs would rather go after one of these groups when they do something than to say you're not allowed to exist and go after them. We have to stop the normalization of it so that it's not, people don't, for example, where I grew up in Lynchburg, go to a Black Lives Matter protest or an anti-reproductive, pro-Roe or, anti-forced birth protest, and just go, oh yeah, the militia guys are up there on that building with their rifles pointing down. That we shouldn't normalize that, right? So not only do you show up, but you call your sheriff or you call your local law enforcement. You say, what are these guys doing here? Have you deputized them? And if you haven't deputized them, why are they here? They shouldn't be here. This is dangerous.
Are you seeing kernels of this counter movement against the militias in Virginia, in the counties that you are studying?
No, not right now. We talked to some people who are opposed to this, and people are in fear. I talked to someone about trying to talk to the NAACP in Bedford County to see how they were responding to this, and it's pretty much defunct. And so I think there's a lot of, and this didn't just happen because of the Bedford militia. This is like 25 years of.
But the assumption you made is that this is the far right against the rest of society. But it seems that where the far right is in fact able to gain traction, that's society. The ground has been taken because the NAACP is defunct.
I guess growing up in the South and living for a good chunk of my life in red states, Kentucky was red, red. Southern Virginia is red. I've often just looked at the absence of resistance and formalized resistance. It wasn't that everyone agreed with it, but there was like this kind of throw up your hands, what can I do kind of thing. And so it's like, maybe you lose, maybe the community is at this point deeply embedded in extremism as a whole, but do we know that? It's hard to tell when there's just, there's the people that don't like it are throwing up their hands or they're afraid. So I'm not talking about Silver Spring. I mean, at this point, like, go to Southern Virginia, but there are people there that don't like it. The question is, what can they do about it?
Carolyn Gallagher, when you find out, please come back.
I'd be happy to.
Yellow flowers at the door. Never heard this way before. Your kindness haunts this room tonight. There's a chill in the air we can't deny. Don't know where to look past. Help me find my way back. I'll come to terms with what I agree, but your yellow flowers beg me not to leave.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with American University professor Carolyn Gallagher? First, I should point out that apart from the 4 Virginia counties we talked about, 3 others considered militia resolutions: Augusta and Rockingham in the Shenandoah Valley, and Tazewell County in southwest Virginia. Augusta and Rockingham rejected the resolutions, but the county government in Tazewell passed it. The evolution of the militia movement from the Timothy McVeigh generation in the 1990s to their current form, where they are allied with factions within local, state, and even federal government and police, is an incredible narrative. Guerrillas under Democrats, paramilitaries under Republicans. We might have said this about Afghanistan and Iraq and even Vietnam, about pro-state and anti-state militia groups. But Southern Virginia? Carolyn Gallagher is right that those who join the militias may have leaned one way in our two-party system from the beginning. Another way to see this might be in terms of levels of government. With federal power headed towards greater liberalism and internationalism in the 1990s, militias gravitated locally. But the return of Republican power under Bush and the 2 wars refocused militia energy to an international enemy. And then Obama and the end of the wars brought them right back in. Federal power in Democratic hands, but locally, in the counties and towns across places like Southern Virginia, the political conditions for militias were more favorable. Then, Trump gives these groups a national voice. The militias then maneuver between levels of government to find hospitable allies, because one thing is true: if the government wanted to end this, they could. We often think of government as ineffective, but state power is real, especially policing authority. If a county or a state government decides it has had enough, it can and usually does prevail. There is cost, but presumably a decision to confront the militias only comes after there is cost anyway. The easier challenge for local jurisdictions, especially those with political ideologies adjacent to militias, is to keep them focused outward at national and even international politics rather than engaging in violence near their homes. If that were to happen against those who are believed to be core members of the local community, rather than interloping outsiders, expect local authority to act and act decisively. Gallagher wants to see a counter-movement to curb the militia. The challenge there is, where militias are dominant, the elements, the roots, the pieces of a counter-movement are unlikely to emerge. Where counter-movements can be organized, for example, against the Proud Boys' harassment of the drag queen story hour in Silver Spring, militias do not exist. The two sides sometimes come together in Silver Spring, but also in Lynchburg's pro-choice protests. But generally, political power remains separated, a contributor perhaps to the national polarization. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Arlington-based roots and Argentinian-tinged world music singer-songwriter Valeria Stewart and her trio Crooked Sparrow. Kevin Dudley on guitar and mandolin, Valeria Stewart on vocals and guitar, and Jenny Smith on the violin. You can find Valeria's music in Spanish and English on her YouTube channel at Valeria Stewart Music. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
¿Cómo decirte? Ya no estoy. Ya pasa el tiempo y no saber que nos lleva el viento y el anochecer. Y el anochecer.